So the first thing we're going to be talking about, like I said, is this prejudice against migrants and the idea that, yes, they might be prejudiced there because they're out-group members, but there also might be prejudice there because they're in the wrong category. We perceive them to be in the wrong place, if you like. And this research was reported in the 2010 paper with my colleagues Stefania Paolini and Richard Crisp in Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. Go ahead and have a look and have a read of that one. But let me start off by talking to you a little bit about this work. So yeah, we've been looking at the tendency for people to have relatively negative attitudes towards migrants. And to give you one example of this migrant bias, a recent survey of 30,000 people from across Europe revealed that 38% of respondents were opposed to normal civil rights for legally established migrants. So when asked, here are some legally established migrants, do you think that they should have the same sort of rights as you? 38% of people said, nuh-uh. And researchers have tended to explain this migrant bias as a specific case of a more general bias against out-group members. And that out-group explanation of migrant bias goes something like this. First of all, migrants are usually members of out-groups. So we were talking about Syrian refugees. Syrian refugees are not normally Australian. They're Syrian, an out-group member for Australians. And I should say that I'm talking to you here from Australia. Number two in the argument is that people tend to be biased against out-group members, and there's a huge amount of research showing this very clear effect from minimal groups where you're just a member of Group A or a member of Group B to real-life situations between, for example, Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. People in one group tend not to like people in another group. 3 adds these two things together, so hence bias against migrants can be explained as a specific form of bias against out-group members. So, for example, the bias shown by a native-born Australian against a Chinese person who's moved to Australia can be explained as a bias shown by a member of an in-group, Australians, against a member of an out-group, Chinese people. And we believe that this out-group bias explanation is a powerful explanation of migrant bias, and we're not trying to challenge it in any way. It's out there, and there's probably a great amount of truth to it. But what we did want to do with this research was to investigate an additional and perhaps more basic explanation of migrant bias that's based on the ease or difficulty with which people cognitively process information about migrants. And this ease or difficulty of cognitive processing is called processing fluency. So processing fluency refers to the ease with which a stimulus can be cognitively processed. So importantly, researchers have found a link between processing fluency and evaluation. The harder it is to process a stimulus, the less likely people are to like that stimulus. So in other words, here I am. If you find it hard to think about something, you're not going to like that thing. Doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't have to be people. Doesn't have to be. It can be just an object. It can be something on television. It can be anything. Basically, this theory applies to. If you find it hard to think about it, you won't like it as much as things that are easy to think about. So, a guy called Whittlesey provided one of the first demonstrations of this relationship between processing fluency and liking. And like I said, he didn't talk about people, he didn't talk about television programs or attitudes or whatever. He talked about just the words in sentences. So he presented his participants with a series of sentences, some of which provided a predictive context for the last word and some of which didn't. So for example, the sentence, "The stormy seas toss the boat," provides a predictive context for the word boat, because boats are things that stormy seas are likely to toss around. Whereas the sentence, "He saved up his money and bought a boat," is non-predictive of the word boat, because he could have saved up his money and bought anything. He saved up his money and bought a PlayStation 4 or something like that. So Whittlesey found that participants pronounced target words slower and evaluated them more negatively when they were presented in a non-predictive context. Where are we? Down here. So they didn't like this word boat as much when they couldn't predict it, compared to when it was in a predictive context, when they would evaluate it much more positively. So that's the first clue we've got, that this processing fluency can make you like or dislike things. So based on Whittlesey's research, we hypothesized that one of the reasons that people may be biased against migrants is that migrants are located in a non-predictive category, and this makes them relatively difficult to process cognitively. So Australia is full of Syrians? Doesn't make sense. It's not correct. And so if you do find Syrians, and I'm not just picking on Syrians, you could have British people, of which I am one of those categories. Australia is full of British people, then it doesn't make sense. It's going to be more difficult for you to process that idea, and consequently you're going to have a negative evaluation of what? And our argument is you'll have a negative evaluation of the thing which is causing that difficulty in processing fluency, the British people, the migrants, basically. So just to give you a bit more of an explanation, let's take the example of a Chinese man who's living in China and then moves to Australia. To begin with, the Chinese man is located in a predictive context. He's living in China, all is good with him. So he's easy to process. Chinese man lives in China, thought so, no worries, no problem for me, I like that. After he's moved to Australia, however, the Chinese man becomes a migrant, and his residence in Australia puts him in a non-predictive context, which makes him relatively difficult to process. And we are proposing in this research that it's those differences in processing fluency that may be at least partially responsible for differences in evaluation between migrants and non-migrants. Non-migrants are easy to process, migrants are more difficult to process. Therefore, people like non-migrants more than migrants. That's our basic idea. So there it is in black and white. If differences in processing fluency are at least partly responsible for migrant bias, then A, migrant bias should persist. In the absence of in-group bias, B, processing fluency should mediate the migrant bias effect. So what we're saying is that you don't need to be, or put more carefully, out-group bias is not necessary in order to have migrant bias occurring, and that also the key explanatory effect here, the thing which is really going to be driving this bias, is processing fluency, the ease or difficulty with which you feel it's possible to think about these different stimuli. So, excuse me. Our direct approach was to measure processing fluency and establish whether or not it acted as a significant mediator of the migrant bias. So we did this in two ways. The first way was weird. The second way was weird but not quite as weird. The first way was to look at non-social targets. So we wanted to pick things, a bit like Whittlesey's example of boats and things like that, which were predictive and non-predictive of the categories to which they belonged. And so we chose some stimuli that were non-social, in other words, they weren't people, and we chose birds and fish, which sounds all right at the moment, but wait till we start talking about emus and igloos, emus and carp and bass and bass and everything like that. So, so I did want to quickly mention that study one that I'm presenting in this presentation was not actually published in the paper that I discussed previously. So it's just sort of an added extra. We think it does show the sort of effects that we were interested in, but you won't find it in the paper, so don't get confused if you're looking around for the fish and birds in Rubin's paper, because it's not there. But I can provide you with more information about it if you would like to get in touch with me. So in order to eliminate outgroup bias from analyses, we created these migrant targets that were not outgroup members by using categories of target stimuli that did not include participants, right? So birds and fish, I'm presuming you are not a bird and you are not a fish. So when we start presenting and talking about these different kinds of birds and fish, you won't go, oh, they're the same as me or they're different from me, because you are a member of neither group. So in a sense, both of them are outgroups, and there's no in-group, out-group relationship to be worried about there. And we also, we used non-social stimuli, and we used minimal groups. So the second point here was we used these minimal group targets, Group A and Group B. Again, the key thing about those groups was that the participants that we asked to complete our study were neither members of Group A nor members of Group B. Therefore, although we were talking about people and social kind of targets here, there was no in-group and there was no out-group. So any migrant bias that we found could not be attributed to a bias against out-groups, given that the participants in our studies were not a member of any of the groups that were being rated. So, and this is where it gets a little bit unusual, as I was explaining to you. We've got bird groups here. So in study 1, we presented participants with this diagram, exactly like this, and we asked them to imagine a situation in which 12 types of bird occupied a group called the bird group, and 12 types of fish occupied a group called the fish group. All is good. The world makes sense. Then participants read that a random assignment determined whether each animal stayed in its original group, moved to the other group, or was excluded from both groups. So in this second set of boxes that you can see over here, here's the transition where things were randomly moved around, and here are the next boxes. So in that second set of boxes, you can see the outcome of the reassignment process. So in the bird group, you've got still eagles and blackbirds and cuckoos, but oh my goodness, you've also got carp and bass, how do you say it, and herring and tuna. And in the fish group, you've still got 4 of the original fish that were there, but you've also got some parrots, geese, hawks, and ostriches floating around the place. Now, at this point, some of you might be mentally throwing up your arms in the air and shouting, but they're not migrants. They've got nothing to do with migrants. What a load of rubbish, to which I'd like to respond, yes, no, and maybe. So yes, these birds and fish obviously are not migrants as we typically think of them. They are certainly a far cry from Chinese migrants living in Australia. However, I would argue that they do have something in common with Chinese migrants. In both cases, the people are judging a target that has moved from a predictive category to a non-predictive category. So we can say that there is a conceptual equivalence between these two types of migrant, at least a very abstract theoretical level. And I'll talk more about the ecological validity of our research a bit later on, whether or not it makes sense to sort of equate these birds and fish with migrants, and can we extrapolate the results and talk about Syrian refugees based on ostriches and chickens. I'll talk about that in a bit later, but for now I would ask that you, that you just basically bear with me and accept that there is some migration going on here, with some birds moving to a fish group and some fish going to a bird group. So we then asked participants, how do you feel about these target animals? So what do you think about that cuckoo in the fish group? What do you think about that mackerel in the bird group? And so on. And they just had to rate them on a negative and positive scale. Now, I ask participants to do weird things, and this is probably one of the weirder things that I've asked participants to do in my studies. You might want to think to yourself, how would I feel if I was being asked to rate them? Can I actually rate? I mean, what is there to rate? How do you determine whether or not a mackerel is negative or positive? And we just simply ask participants, go with your gut feeling. Go with what you feel, and if you can't make a decision, just try. So it was under those circumstances that participants were making these ratings, basically. And we also asked them to give us an indication of how difficult or easy they found it to make their liking judgment. And of course, a lot of people would find it difficult, as I was just saying. But the question is, how difficult? And were there differences? Were there differences in the difficulty between rating of migrant fish and birds and non-migrant fish and birds? So they rated 24 animals in that way, and here are the liking and difficulty ratings for migrants and control targets. So the blue bars here represent liking, and the red bars represent processing fluency. So the bigger the bar, the more you like the thing, and the the more difficulty you had processing it. Okay? And lo and behold, we find a migrant bias, if you like. We found that people, when they are rating cuckoos and blackbirds in the birds group, they like them more than they were rating cuckoos and blackbirds in the fish group. It made more sense, obviously. So things fitted in, and they liked things fitting in compared to the sort of illogical category inconsistency of blackbirds and blackbirds and cuckoos in the fish group. And this was collapsed across categories. So, you had, in the migrant condition, we had blackbirds and cuckoos in the fish group combined with mackerels and carp in the bird group. They were all described as migrants. So like I said, the red bars here represent processing difficulty. The bigger the bar, the more difficult participants found it to make their liking ratings. And again, as predicted, participants rated the migrants. They found it more difficult to rate migrants compared to the control groups, which is exactly what we predicted. It fits in with Whittlesey's previous research. I saved up my money and bought a boat, or the stormy seas tossed the boat around. Here, when you've got difficult sort of migrants, animals in the wrong category, people find it more difficult to process those things. And using Judd et al.'s 2001 within subjects mediation technique, which basically just is a way of determining whether these two effects, the liking effect and the processing effect, are not only correlated with one another, which they were, by the way. So the more difficult you found it to rate these things, the less you like them. But also this mediation technique allowed us to determine whether the one explains statistically the other. And in fact, we found some positive evidence for that. So it was differences in processing fluency which provided a statistical explanation of differences in liking. The more difficult people found it, the bigger the difference between migrants and controls in processing fluency, the bigger the difference between migrants and controls in liking. So, although it was a weird experiment, it was consistent with what we were expecting. In study 2, we got a little bit closer to real life, but as you'll see now, not that much closer. We looked at minimal groups, which are groups which people are randomly assigned to and just on a very random basis. So they're not like real world groups where you have a history of belonging to the group. There are all sorts of norms that go along with them. There are status differences and power differences between the groups. These are very artificial, transitory, lab-based groups which have none of that stuff attached to them. And that's why social psychologists like them, in fact, is because they strip away all of the accessories that groups carry with them, and you just have the bare bones of groups, the minimal aspects of the groups. And that's what we wanted to look at. And we particularly wanted to look at them because in this way we could make sure that people were not members of the groups. So participants imagined a situation in which people were randomly divided into two equal-sized groups called Group A and Group B. What do they mean? They mean nothing. So it's just labels to signify, to identify these groups. And they further imagined that some people stayed in their original group, control target people, and some people from both groups changed to the other group. So they were migrant groups. If someone was a Group A member and they moved to Group B, then we have a migrant person in our artificial kind of world. So we asked participants to imagine a situation in which a group of people were assembled together in a room and randomly divided into two equal-sized groups called A and B. And participants further imagined that through a process of random selection, some people were selected to stay in their original group and some people were selected to move group, to change group. And then we just had a couple of rating tasks to find out what people thought about each kind of person. So they were asked to award points to control and migrant members of these groups using some multiple allocation matrices, which are just ways of allocating points to people. So it's like a scale where you say, well, this person deserves to get this many points and this person deserves to get fewer. The more points you get, the better you like the person. And people are usually told in this kind of task to consider these multiple allocation matrices are sort of like a game where the more points you get, the better it is. So if you win the game, you get more points. And there was also a trait rating task where participants were asked to rate how much they imagined that people who stayed in their group and people who changed to the group possess 5 positive and 5 negative traits. Again, you might imagine as a participant that this is a difficult thing to do, and I'm sure it was. But the question was, even under these very difficult and abstract and kind of meaningless conditions, was there any difference in the amount of positivity and negativity allocated to people who stayed in their group versus people who left their group? And what were these people like? Well, to give you an example, participants were asked to award points to person B11 of group B, who would represent a control target, and person B7 of group A, who would represent a migrant target. So person B7 indicates which group they originally came from. They're person number 7 originally from group B, and they're now in group A. So you've got an idea about who they are, what number they are, what group they originally belonged to, and what group they are belonging to at the moment. So what did we find out here? Well, here are the results for the points distribution task, and as you can see, we found again the expected migrant bias. People awarded significantly fewer points, and don't worry about the scale here, we just added up the number of points, so it's the point here is the difference between the points that were given. And they awarded fewer points to migrants, number B7 from group A, compared to control people, number A3 from group A, for example. However, contrary to predictions, participants' difficulty ratings did not actually mediate that particular effect. We're not sure why that was, so things didn't go all our way in this experiment, and that was a null finding that was unexpected. We also had some trait ratings, like I said. How positive do you find these people, how negative, and there were a variety of traits that they were rated on. And again, we find exactly the same effect. Migrants were rated less positively than controls. Now again, just to reinforce this point, our whole sort of raison d'etre for this research was to try to demonstrate that migrant bias could happen outside of outgroup bias. And that's what's happening here. That people were the participants who are rating these people were neither members of group A nor members of group B. So from their perspective, all of these were outgroup members. So there was no bias in terms of, well, they're a member of my group and they're not a member of my group. These people were all part of the same other group, if you like. And also we found differences in processing fluency. So again, as expected, people found it more difficult to rate the migrants than they did to rate the controls. So what can we conclude from those studies? Well, number one, migrant bias can occur in the absence of outgroup bias. So yes, part of the reason that people don't like migrants is because migrants are usually members of groups to which we do not belong, and we tend not to like members of groups to which we do not belong. That's one definite reason for migrant bias. But our research is showing that that condition is not necessary for migrant bias to occur, and it can occur when you are, when those in-group, out-group dynamics are not in action. And the other sort of explanation then for why we think that despite excluding any out-group bias, that you can get this migrant bias is due to processing fluency. So we found in this study that people found it more difficult to process, to think about migrants compared to non-migrants, and that difference in processing fluency was correlated with and mediated the migrant bias that we found. So it appears there's this very general kind of cognitive concern about category consistency, things being in the right categories that can drive this kind of effect. So there are some alternative explanations, and I just I just wanted to talk to you about one of them. When you're doing research like this in these very minimal conditions, participants, like I say, get quite confused and look around the experimental situation and to try and find something to pin their responses on, because they've got nothing. If I ask you, is that cuckoo positive or is that cuckoo negative? You're going to go, what are you talking about? What do you mean positive, negative? I don't understand on earth what you're trying to get from me. And so in those situations where it's a very meaningless situation, you'll look around the experimental situation and try to look for clues about what the researcher is asking from you and what kind of response you're supposed to be giving. And that's why in these particular very abstract studies, it's very important to assess what we call demand characteristics, which are characteristics within the study which demand or require a certain type of response from the participant. So the question that we really wanted to address in this particular research was there anything that was in our studies, were there any cues or anything which were causing the effects that we found in a very artifactual way, rather than people actually providing their genuine responses? In other words, were participants showing a migrant bias because that's what they thought the researchers wanted them to show and they had no other idea about how to behave, and so under those circumstances they just showed migrant bias because they thought, that's what I'm supposed to do, there's nothing else I can do, I may as well do it. So to check for that, we asked them these questions. We just said, tell us how much you agree or disagree with these 4 items. And they responded to them. And we looked to see whether or not we created a single item score out of this, which is a measure of the perceived awareness of the research hypothesis, is what we called it. And we checked whether or not that perceived awareness of the research hypothesis correlated with any of our results, and in fact it didn't. So it seems that the results that we obtained were genuine results reflecting some sort of a genuine cognitive system, rather than spurious artifactual results reflecting what our participants believed that we wanted them to tell us, if you like. So that's good news. And like I say, the other sort of limitation of this study is this thing, low ecological validity. So some people will find it difficult to equate a carp in a bird group or person B11 of group A with real-world migrants, and I accept that it is difficult. However, people like Brewer and Mook would argue that low ecological validity does not necessarily threaten the overall validity or usefulness of our research. A high degree of ecological validity would be essential for research that intended to explain a particular instance of migrant bias as it occurred in the real world. However, our research is not intended to provide that type of explanation. Instead, it's intended to test a set of predictions that are drawn from a particular theoretical explanation of migrant bias. And so in that respect, our research is similar to the classic work by Ash, Milgram and Tajfel. They all use very artificial lab-based methods to advance our understanding of our theoretical understanding of conformity, obedience and in-group favoritism. We are following the same kind of tradition with this work. What we show in these studies is not migrant bias as it occurs in the real world. The targets that we use are not migrants as they occur in the real world. And so we cannot really make a massive leap and say, well, look, we are demonstrating these sort of effects that happen in the real world. However, what we are showing are some basic processes that might be applicable in the real world. And the big test is to show that they do occur in the real world. And that's where we need to do further research in order to say, well, are people biased against Syrian refugees and British people living in Australia because they find them more difficult to think about? So that's the gap in this research that needs filling at the moment. Just looking ahead also at some future research areas here. Winkleman, Riebert and colleagues have speculated that time pressure, limited cognitive capacity and or a lack of motivation all force people to rely more on their initial fluency-based gut response. So if you're under time pressure and you've got a lot to think about and you haven't got the capacity to focus on this stuff and you're not really motivated to focus on it, then you are more likely to go to base your evaluations on your initial fluency. So how easy is it to think about things, and how difficult is it to think about things? If it's an important issue, if it's whether or not you should be pro or anti-abortion, you're not going to go, well, this is pro-abortion is too hard to think about, therefore I don't like it. That's not the sort of reasoning that's going on here. It's only if you've got very little time pressure, very limited cognitive capacity, and very low motivation that this heuristic, if you like, this idea that the ease or difficulty with which it is to think about things is going to come into play. So on that basis, then, we might think that processing fluency would be most likely to make a significant contribution to migrant bias in the real world when people do have lots of time pressure, not much ability to think about things, and low motivation. So you think about border guards and things like that being biased against migrants, perhaps we want to make sure that they have not very much time pressure, they have a lot of cognitive capacity, and they are motivated to seriously consider the people rather than stimuli within consistent and inconsistent categories. Hello again. I just wanted to let you know about a research website that is available which provides more information about my research. I talk about not only the things that I've talked about today, but also other research projects that are going on and have been completed. So I do a lot of stuff about social class as well. And you can also find out about how to apply for a PhD and how to apply for scholarships if you would like to join me in investigating the sorts of things that I've talked about today. So please feel welcome. I'll get rid of my face and you can have a look at the link there. You can freeze the frame and copy that down and go and visit that website and find out more about me and my work. Thank you very much.